Welcome to Truth Watchers. I am Heath Henning. I have wanted to discuss this issue of music in the churches for a while on this podcast and figured I might as well just jump into this important topic. This is a touchy topic for many people because it is connecting people's emotions and produces emotional responses. This fact should be understood as music has been called the language of the soul. It does affect us emotionally, so we obviously have emotional connections to it. So I want people to set their emotions aside to think logically about what I'm about to discuss. The fact that music affects us emotionally should prove it has a mystical element to it. That is what I am going to be focusing on in the discussion today. The fact that many churches are purposely selecting a type of music to produce mystical experiences for their audience. These fabricated mystical experiences are mistaken for quasi-religious spiritual experiences. This is actually occultism infiltrating churches. Since I recently did an interview with Dr. Chris Berg about yoga, I think it is worth starting off this discussion with a quote from a secular historian, William Durant, who authored a 10-volume set titled History of Civilization. In volume 1, he mentions the Hindus' use of music to produce a mystical state. On page 588, he writes, quote, "The Hindu musician is like the Hindu philosopher. He starts with the finite and sends his soul into the infinite. He embroiders upon his theme until, through an undulating stream of rhythm and recurrence, even through a hypnotizing monotony of notes, he has created a kind of musical yoga, a forgetfulness of will and individuality, of matter, space, and time. The soul is lifted into an almost mystic union with something deeply infused, some profound, immense, and quiet being, some primordial and pervasive reality that smiles upon all striving wills, all change and death." Unquote. Notice how he described this Hindu music as rhythm having recurrence and being hypnotizing monotony. He calls this musical yoga and mystic union. So we see heathen religions have practiced using music to produce mystic feelings of union with their idea of God or gods. So let us ask this question first. Does the God of the Bible want us as Christians to emulate this kind of music in our worship? Chun Jun A. Lee, a contributing author to the book Spirituality in Interfaith Dialogue, wrote a chapter titled Beyond Words and Logic, wherein it states on page 44, quote, "Mantra chanting has the power to silence the mind and emotions and eventually to enable the chanter to sink into the abyss of utter silence where the internal dialogue ceases and true prayer happens." Unquote. Again, the focus here is the inducing of a mystical state. Note how it is established by mantra chanting. That is the repetitive chanting of words or short phrases until one has the feeling of union with the deity. Does that sound like the type of music played in your church? Monotony, repetitive, hypnotizing? Another contributor of this book, Pascaline Koff, wrote on page 47, quote, "It is often more suitable to sing one line again and again when it fits the theme of a feast rather than a hymn of many stanzas that are not particularly appropriate. And, of course, repetition is the mother of learning." Unquote. I want to note again the repetitiveness, mantra-like singing these authors are advocating. Secondly, the whole theme of this book is interfaith dialogue. In other words, the theme is producing mystical experiences, and these authors discuss music to do this with, to bring different religions together. To make this point very clear, those advocating for a one world religion are intending music and mysticism to be the major way to break down any barriers. An interfaith bridge is being built by trance-inducing music. Lady Sabrina, a Wiccan high priestess, defines the word incantation in her glossary as, quote, the act of singing, chanting, or speaking formulaic words, phrases, or sounds to raise energy for manipulation during spellcasting and ritual magic, unquote. That's from Lady Sabrina Exploring Wicca, page 199. So music is being used for manipulation and casting spells, incantations as ritual magic. This stuff is well known and understood in occult religions, but sadly in Christianity, it seems to be an ignorant point which has allowed the occult to creep in unawares. In 1997, author Hank Hanegraaff wrote his book Counterfeit Revival. In this book, he was assessing some of the so-called revivals taking place in charismatic circles. One point he emphasized was the dependence of these false revivals to engage in mysticism, and music was one of the ways to induce these mystical states, also referred to as altered states of consciousness. On page 221, Hank Hanegraaff wrote, quote, one of the most disarming methods used is to sing one song over and over until participants finally lose touch with reality, unquote. When we put this stuff together, we see it is monotonous, repetitive music used to manipulate and hypnotize people, as with magic incantations, to stir them into a mystical, altered state of consciousness so they feel as if they are having union with God. This is the music method of Hinduism. It is music that mimics the mantra method that mystic religions manufacture to manipulate emotions with mindless meditation techniques. Look at this quote from James Garlow and Peter Jones closely. They write, quote, the first goal to spiritual ecstasy is mindlessness, a state sought in Hindu and Buddhist meditation, often through the repetition of a mantra. The term mantra comes from two Sanskrit words, man, to think, and tra, to be liberated, unquote. The purpose of this music is to be liberated from thinking. That is hypnosis. You stop thinking for yourself and allow someone else to control you. That is why the Wiccan priestess quoted above used the word manipulation as casting spells with incantation songs. If your normal church experience is spending most of the time singing repetitive songs followed by a short sermon which has low theological content, you're being hypnotized and manipulated. Furthermore, you're being primed for the one world religion of the end time apostasy. You're being manipulated to be a mindless follower of the coming Antichrist. This is building the bridge of interfaith dialogue. This is the major contrast to how the Bible depicts our worship of God. Deuteronomy 12, verse 29 through 32 warns the Jewish nation when they would enter into the promised land that they were not to inquire of the pagan nations how they worshiped their idols. It states, quote, when the Lord thy God shall cut off the nations from before thee, whither thou goest to possess them, and thou succeedest them, and dwellest in their land, take heed to thyself that thou be not snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before thee, and that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. Thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God. For every abomination to the Lord, which he hateth, have they done unto their gods. For even their sons and their daughters have they burnt in the fire to their gods. What thing soever I command you, observe to do it. Thou shalt not add thereto, nor diminish from it. Unquote. Deuteronomy 12, verses 29 through 32. This seems to be the major missing element of Christianity today. Many churches are looking to how the rest of the world wants to worship their gods. For example, Rick Warren talked about in his book, The Purpose-Driven Church, how he planted Saddleback Community Church. He said he went door to door looking for quote-unquote unchurched people in the community with a survey and what they wanted in a church, how to run the church, children's programs, nurseries, and of course, what kind of music, among other things. So he was advocating to build a church based on not Christians, what he called unchurched wanted. He never considered studying the Bible to learn what God demanded a church to be like. He structured his megachurch around the unregenerate people thought a church should be like. Should I even have to ask if this is what God wants in a church? It is obvious Rick Warren never even considered what God wants in a church. Yet his ministry principles and church growth method has been adopted by so many churches in the past few decades. Similarly, Bill Hybels from Willow Creek Church endorsed these church growth methods. They both learned from Robert Schuller of the Crystal Cathedral. Schuller was an absolute apostate advocating New Thought theology and followed Norman Vincent Peale's view on church growth. Norman Vincent Peale plagiarized a New Thought heretic Florence Scovel Shinn. This is a long line of heretical influences that has dominated church growth ideas going back to the late 1800s. That, not even mentioning Rick Warren's indebtedness to the self-proclaimed Buddhist business guru Peter Drucker. His influences caused churches to be structured like businesses that are providing products to consumers, offering what they desire to consume. This is the way of the heathen that we should not seek to inquire into. Pastor Mike Foster wrote the book, The Spiritual Song, The Missing Element in Church Music. On page 16, he wrote, quote, I am disturbed by the increasing number of choruses that are being substituted for the great hymns and spiritual songs of our faith. These choruses, some of which are out of the contemporary Christian music, CCM world, are many times shallow, lack true symmetry in poetry, are very repetitious, and teach no doctrine whatsoever. Psalm 47, verse 7, presents us with an interesting command. Sing ye praises with understanding. The term understanding means to act circumspect or to act intellectually. When we sing in church, we should sing praises to God, being careful how we sing, unquote. Indeed, there is a big difference between singing repetitious mantra-like songs that are purposed to cause you to stop thinking and the biblical concept of singing praises to God with understanding, which is to act intellectually. Singing praises to God is not an existential experience-based exercise. If and when our emotions are affected by music, it is because we are intellectually stirred by understanding and realizing the holiness of God, his goodness, or our depravity of sin and offenses against him. In 1 Corinthians 14, verse 15, the Apostle Paul commends, quote, what is it then? I will pray with the Spirit. I will pray with understanding also. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also, unquote. That's 1 Corinthians 14, verse 15. We see Paul described singing with the Spirit as singing with understanding. There is no disjunction with what was taught in the Old Testament, as in Psalms 47, verse 7, about singing praises with understanding. The only disjunction here is what the Bible describes and demands about music and praise of God with what was commonly practiced in pagan religious rituals. The problem is that there is a major movement of apostasy and an ideology of interfaith spreading through churches worldwide. The music has endowed a lack of intellectual theology and understanding of God because the current idea infected by the postmodernist mentality is to experience God, not understanding God. So there is a whole lot of theological shallow and biblically ignorant people who think they are Christians because they had a quasi-spiritual experience produced by heathen music in a church setting. It should be no surprise that we see a proliferation of false doctrines among self-identified Christians in the various polls taken these days. When I worked with evangelism on a local university campus, I met dozens of young students that grew up in Bill Hybels' Willow Creek Church. Every single one of these students I met from the church never heard the gospel until I shared it with them. The entirety of the young generation of that church was unregenerate to my experience of meeting them. They all identified themselves as Christians, but not one had a true conversion. I suspect this is true of the overwhelming majority of megachurches in America today. Theologian Charles Ryrie asks, quote, "Can we glean any principles from the use of music in the church today? The New Testament examples includes doxology, praise, the character of God, and his works with language that is rich, not thin and repetitious." Unquote. That is from Charles Ryrie's Basic Theology, page 430. Music should teach meaningful doctrines as well as be presented as praise to God. Shallow, repetitious lyrics are neither of these things. Christians need to stop feeding the beast. You're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. If you're in a church that has this type of music, leave that church and find one that will honor God with biblical music. As long as false teachers continue to have large numbers of goats attending their church for entertainment, they will continue to provide their consumers with what they want. But what a true Christian should desire is a church that offers God true worship and deep teaching of sound doctrine. Stop feeding the flesh and start feeding the spirit with truth. I think I'm going to have to park on this issue of music for a while because it's an important topic that is neglected or simply not understood by many Christians today. So I'll be back with more on the topic of music. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning into Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend for more fascinating facts. Check us out at truthwatchers.com because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as it is indicated in 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.